Right, thank you, Dr. Ahmed. My name is Richard. I will be your moderator today. Quickly, I just wish to go over the format. We will have 3 speakers this morning. We will hear from each one of them, and then we will open the floor to a wider discussion. We will then have a short break, and we'll come back for a second session with the same format. I just want to add my thank yous to the various staff involved, to the people, and for all of you for coming today to deal with this subject, which I think, as Dr. Ahmed said, unfortunately, in light of recent events, has become very pressing. The international system, as we all know, is state-based. Our understandings, our evidence, the way we go about doing things is based on states as the primary units. Non-state actors have imposing challenges to our understandings for a number of years, from the post-World War II period and decolonization to current events. However, current events are different now. The international system has declared, I think, beyond any doubt, that the use of violence to achieve political goals in the absence of self-defense is unacceptable. And this is something that we have to keep in mind when looking at the activities of some of these current groups. As Dr. Ahmed pointed out, non-state actors are now posing challenges, but not just challenges, actually threats to a more secure and peaceful world, and we'll be listening to our experts on their views on how we can address these things. On this morning's panel, we have Professor Theo Farrell, head of the Department of War Studies at King's College, Dr. David Betts, Reader in Warfare in the Department of War Studies at King's College, and Elias Diab, a humanitarian affairs specialist and somebody who works with the UN. Their biographies are all in your brochures, so I'm not going to go into anything further. I would just like to now invite Theo to join us. Ending Insurgency, Lessons from Afghanistan. Theo.
Richard, thank you. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I thought I would speak for about 20 minutes on about the war in Afghanistan and the key lessons that are applicable to the new wars that we face today. And the war in Afghanistan is a war that I've studied for over 6 years, and over that time have conducted a number of assessments of the conduct of operations on the ground for the British government. And I've also been involved in the conduct of 3 strategic reviews of the war for the commander of ISAF. So I'm studying this war with a lot of insight on the ground. And I want to talk about 4 key lessons which may be applicable to the challenges facing the United Arab Emirates today. So the first lesson is to understand the object and the center of gravity of the conflict that you're in. The center of gravity is the thing in the campaign that you're conducting that will unlock success. It's the key thing that will deliver success to you. In conventional war, the object is pretty straightforward. In conventional war, the object is to seize ground, is to seize territory. So you invade a country, you seize the territory. And therefore, the center of gravity is pretty straightforward. It's to destroy the enemy's forces. But in counterinsurgency, it's much more complicated. In counterinsurgency, the object is not to seize territory. It is to win over the people. And the center of gravity is not to destroy the enemy forces, although you might do that as part of a counterinsurgency campaign. The center of gravity is to win the hearts and minds of the people. It's very different. Now, if you study warfare, this is all pretty routine stuff. This is very well established in counterinsurgency doctrine. And indeed, it was very well put by the French theorist David Gallois when he said that in counterinsurgency, only 20% of the campaign is military stuff. 80% is non-military activities. And yet what's remarkable when you look at the war in Afghanistan, and just to understand, the war in Afghanistan since 2001 has been conducted in 2 phases. There's the initial phase in 2001 to 2002, where the United States leads a coalition to overthrow the Taliban emirate. And the Taliban flee the country, or they go to ground. And then in 2004 and 5, the Taliban sneak back into the south of Afghanistan and the east. And that coincides in 2006 with the international forces expanding into the south and the east. And we see a second phase of the war from 2006 up to today. And what's interesting in that second phase, which is clearly a counterinsurgency, and when you look particularly at the British experience, but also the American and the Canadian, The focus for the first 2 years is on destroying enemy forces. It's not on winning hearts and minds, but rather it is a very conventional fight. It's not really till 2009 that the international forces relearn the lesson that we learned in the 50s and 60s from the wars of decolonization, and that lesson being that the main effort should not be to destroy the enemy forces. And the point is that there are very, very few examples in history where you can militarily defeat an insurgency. Very few. And there's no example where you can defeat an insurgency where you don't control the border and where the insurgency is backed by a foreign power. If those two conditions exist, it is impossible to defeat the insurgency. That's the first lesson. The second lesson, therefore, is regarding the importance of an integrated civil-military campaign. So we understand that there's a military part of a counterinsurgency where the job is to push back the insurgents, keep them away from the population, and just retard their military capability. And for that, by the way, you must have ground forces. It cannot be done through air power. You must use ground forces to keep the insurgents at bay. But there's also a civilian element of the operation, of the campaign, and that's regarding building services and infrastructure for people and giving them jobs. Because you win their hearts and minds by basically giving them basic security and improving their lives. That's critical, and that requires civilian operations. But you need an integrated campaign because the military have to provide security for civilian operators and have to provide the logistics for this. And again, this is not new for the British. The British have been doing this in Northern Ireland for 30 years, where the military were providing military assistance to the civilian powers. The British were doing this in Bosnia, as were the French and other powers, when they were supporting the United Nations operations in Bosnia. And yet what you find in the 2000s is we still don't have an integrated approach, where the Foreign Office and the Development, DFID, Development Office and the military, the Ministry of Defence, are cooperating. And so we see the development of new doctrine in Britain, a thing called a comprehensive approach, a new doctrine that's developed in 2006, which talks about bringing together the civilian and military lines of operation. The problem with the comprehensive approach as a doctrine is that it's written by the military, and therefore it's ignored by people in the Foreign Office and in DFID, in the Development Office. And the fact is, although there's now very good doctrine, and I would recommend strongly Joint Doctrine Publication 3-40, which was published in 2009, the result of a massive effort by the British military to develop very good doctrine on how to conduct counterinsurgency operations. The fact is it's ignored on the ground. And so when you look at the conduct of operations, as I've suggested on the ground in 2006 and 2007 and 2008, this joint approach is basically ignored. And it's not till later on we see the development of a combined approach, a joint approach on the ground. And the key innovation here are the development of what are called provincial reconstruction teams. The actual idea, the innovation, is the brainchild of a man called Nick Carter, he's current head of the British Army. But in 2003, he was a planner, a mere colonel in a US military command. And he came up with the idea of the provincial reconstruction team. And this brings together military and civilian in a combined team to deliver civilian operations on the ground with military assistance. And we see improvements in 2009 and 10 in the conduct of an integrated campaign on the ground in Afghanistan. But I have to say, in late 2010, I conducted an assessment of the whole campaign for the commander of ISAF Joint Forces, where I traveled the country and interviewed all the senior staff to ask them, has the campaign become more unified? Are we seeing the different elements of the campaign, the Canadians, the Germans, the Americans pulling together? And the result was, headline was yes, on the military side. As a consequence of a more centralized international force in Afghanistan, we saw a more integrated military effort. But on the civilian side, it got worse. Because in 2009, 2010, various civilian agencies put more staff into Afghanistan, more money, and that made the situation more complex, and there was less integration in the campaign. Okay, the third lesson is about local governance. At the end of the day, even though insurgencies very often are driven by external powers, and we see that very much today in Yemen, the same is true in Afghanistan with regards to Pakistan's support to the Taliban. where you see foreign powers interfering in local conflicts. Even though insurgencies can be very much resourced and backed by foreign powers, at the end of the day, insurgencies are built on local grievances. If you don't have local grievances, you won't have an insurgency. And we saw that very clearly in Afghanistan. If you look at the rise of the Taliban in the 1990s, it was built on local grievance with regards to very abusive and predatory rule in southern and eastern Afghanistan, and the lack of security. And we see it also with the return of the Taliban in 2005 and 2006. Because actually what happens is when the Americans and the British, when they defeat the Taliban and they overthrow the Taliban in 2001, and Hamid Karzai is appointed the interim head of the Afghan state, and subsequently president of Afghanistan. The warlords that had been expelled by the Taliban in the mid-1990s returned to power in southern Afghanistan. And these warlords return with their same predatory rule and abusive government towards the local people, with the same predatory and abusive police forces. And so we see once again the people turning against the government. And so when the Taliban return in 2005 and 6, they find a local population that by and large welcomes them. Because even though the Taliban government was quite repressive, it was still better than what the Afghan government was offering. So what's really important for counterinsurgency is to support the development of representative, legitimate, and competent local governance, both in terms of the local governor, but also in terms of the local district community council or shura that, as part of that effort. And what's interesting when you look at how the British conducted counterinsurgency in Helmand province in southern Afghanistan, from 2006 up to 2008, they pretty much ignored local government. They didn't put a lot of effort into local government. Most of the effort on the ground was put into developing services and infrastructure. And so civilians were deployed on the ground into districts, and their job was to irrigate the local canals, pay for the digging of wells, the building of schools, giving jobs to locals. And actually, that can be quite unhelpful because if you put resources into infrastructure and jobs, but you don't do it by working with local people, what you're actually doing is empowering one part of a community and disempowering another. And that can actually make the conflict worse. And the British eventually figured this out. And in 2009, they deployed more civilians into Helmand, but these were political officers. And their job was to get local governance running. And so thereafter, all the money the British spent on wells and schools, on roads, on jobs, all that money was put through local government. It was local community councils that decided what the money should be spent on. And so you empowered local communities. It was really important. You got a double bang for your buck. You both provided jobs and you increased services and infrastructure, but at the same time you empowered local government. And here I want to highlight what is a key lesson from the whole campaign in Afghanistan, and that is the paradox of capacity building. At the end of the day, developing Afghan government and Afghan security forces was the key to the international forces leaving Afghanistan. So the international forces never wanted to stay, they always wanted to leave. But they could only leave when the Afghan government was strong enough to govern by itself and the Afghan security forces were strong enough to secure the country by themselves. And so what the international community did is they poured money into Afghanistan, a lot of money, to build a government and security forces very quickly. And the problem there is that if you actually have a government that's quite corrupt and security forces that are quite corrupt, by pouring the money in so quickly, you actually feed the corruption, you make it worse. And the government is no longer accountable to the people. It doesn't need the people. It needs international money. So the government just needs international money. It's not accountable to the local people. And so you're making the corruption worse. And so what you actually want to do is build capacity in the government and security forces, but do it in a way that ensures some accountability. The fourth and final lesson is the importance of peace talks. This is a logical corollary, it's a logical extension of my argument that it's impossible to achieve military victory in a counterinsurgency. It therefore means you must at some stage talk to the insurgents. You must have peace talks. And in this sense, the job of military operations is to bring the insurgents to the peace table, to the negotiation table. In any insurgency, there will be the hardliners and there will be the pragmatists. Very often the hardliners will be the military commanders or in the military wing of the insurgency, and there'll be a political wing of the insurgency. We clearly see this in Afghanistan. Even when you go back to the Taliban emirate in the 1990s, you have the hardliners around Mullah Omar in Kandahar, but you have the pragmatists actually running the country in Kabul. And you certainly see it in the Taliban today, where you see the hardliners are obviously the field commanders and those that are in the military commissions in Peshawar and Quetta. But you also have a political wing of the Taliban in the political commission, and now based in Doha. So there are important implications for counterinsurgency, in the conduct of counterinsurgency, and in particular in what the Americans call high-value targeting, when you use special strikes to take out insurgent leaders. Because the problem is you need to make sure you don't kill the leader that you need to talk to in peace talks later. The British government talks about the Gerry Adams problem. When peace was made in Northern Ireland, Gerry Adams, who was a leader of the political side of the IRA, was critical to those peace talks. But if he had been killed, the question is, could we have had peace? The problem is that in practice, on both sides, both the international side and the Taliban side, what you tend to get is on one side or the other at different points will enjoy military momentum. So in ISAF, in the international forces, there was military momentum in 2009, 2010, and that would have been the perfect time to start peace talks with the Taliban because you were putting immense pressure on them. But the military commanders wanted to hold out because they were looking for that elusive tipping point when they would defeat the insurgency militarily, which is impossible. Now today, the Taliban enjoy the momentum. We clearly see that since 2015, when the international forces withdrew from the field. And we're clearly seeing, as we saw in Kunduz, when the Taliban seized Kunduz, they have the military momentum. And therefore, they're not interested in peace talks. And yet, ironically, today is the best time for the Taliban to start peace talks, because they have the military momentum. So the lesson here is it's very important to find the pragmatists in an insurgency, to understand what their red lines are, the things that they will not negotiate on, and therefore to define the negotiating space, or what the international community call the trade space, because that's where you can conduct negotiations. It's also very important to pursue multiple lines of negotiation. Don't rest all your hopes on just one track. With regards to Afghanistan, initially back in 2013, all the hopes were placed on the Taliban office opening in Doha, and that effort collapsed. And now today, all the hopes are resting on a track that's being pushed forward by Pakistan, and that too has come into problems. And so I've co-authored an article that's about to be published in December in the British journal Survival, where myself and my colleague Michael Semple talk about the importance of multiple lines of negotiation with insurgents, because you can't rely on any one track. And so to summarize, the four key lessons I take from Afghanistan, which I think are applicable to almost any insurgency, are: one, understand the object and the center of gravity of the campaign. Two, develop an integrated civil-military campaign. Three, focus on local governance. That is critical to winning the hearts and minds of the people and ultimately delivering success. And four, be prepared for peace talks. Thank you very much.